Yesterday, I made a video on how you can make some powerful Yu-Gi-Oh decks with $50, but today, we gonna be balling on a budget. Honestly, I really cannot bring myself to throw away these Pit Vipers. These are my favorite pair, but they're missing the other thing, and I'm too broke to afford another one. Today, I've constructed a tier list with some of the most popular and powerful budget Yu-Gi-Oh decks, and I am going to be ranking them from the top budget, the decks you'll get the most bang for your buck from, all the way down to pay the bills instead. Hey, at least your imaginary girlfriend won't be mad at you when you pay the bills instead of buying Yu-Gi-Oh cards, because we all have that, right? Right? All right, big dog, the criteria is really simple for this particular tier list. Again, we are going to be using some of the most popular budget strategies, but I also made a post on my last tier list saying what are some strategies that I missed, and every single one of them is on this tier list. I will actually be sure to leave a pinned comment. Again, go ahead and post on that comment, and I'll be sure to get as many of the decks as possible that fit the criteria onto the next tier list. I can't wait to see what you guys have to say. Every single one of these decks on this particular tier list are going to be built in mind of a $100 budget range. That's a little bit of a boost from yesterday's video, but gives us the playability to be able to play some really powerful decks. I will also be ranking them on how good are they right now and their current upgrade ability. If you dump more money into the strategy, will it get better? Let's go ahead and start off with Altergeist, a deck that is now even cheaper because of the Pot of Prosperity reprint. I am ultra confident that you can get this deck for maybe about $30 now, which is crazy, but I'm gonna put it in takes a really good pilot. One of the biggest problems with Altergeist is consistency sometimes, being able to establish the board that it wants, but the next biggest problem is going second. This deck can struggle a little bit against any deck that sets up a board first. By no means, it is not a bad Yu-Gi-Oh deck, and the support from Duelist Nexus made the deck a lot better, but it's gonna take a big brain player to be able to play through those particular situations. I love that Pot of Prosperity, Infinite Impermanence, and Evenly Matched all got reprinted. This deck is really cheap because of it, and then there was actually Blackwing reprints inside of there as well. Now, to be fair, Blackwing Simoon was already ridiculously cheap, but having access to those staples make Blackwings a borderline budget Yu-Gi-Oh deck. Blackwing just so happened to be one of the strongest character Yu-Gi-Oh decks that you can find. It's really fun, sometimes can be a little bit inconsistent, but has a clear-cut win condition of summoning Blackwing Assault Dragons and burning your opponent for every interaction. It's a fairly fun deck. This deck can be pretty insane in the right hands, but it does have a cap at upgradability, kind of like how Crystal Beasts also have a cap at upgradability. The 3 structure decks that you bought it with. For the consecutive tier list that Crystal Beast is in, I'm gonna put it in Pay the Bills instead. There are some Yu-Gi-Oh players that are playing with stones and crystals, hoping that this deck will be a lot stronger. Unfortunately, it's not that good right now. One thing you don't want about your particular deck is to be heavily supported by off-theme cards, because you can just use those off-theme cards in better decks, and unfortunately right now, that's Crystal Beast. There's really only 3 good Crystal Beast monster cards. Everything else feels really bad to play. Ironically, Crystal Beast is a little bit stronger in Master Duel, which I find is really weird, but Ignister, this strategy is a Cyberse Yu-Gi-Oh deck, meaning that you can cram a ton of hand interruptions inside of it. I would put Ignister in borderline. And the reason why I think Ignister is a borderline Yu-Gi-Oh deck is because its inboard isn't as powerful as some of the other Cyberse decks. This deck does 1-card combo into its arrival at Ignister, but that's not really that powerful in Yu-Gi-Oh right now, especially considering that Underworld Goddess is a card that just about every player plays because they have the extra deck space. Overall though, it is not a bad way to play Cyberse. It's just one of the weaker strategies right now because the other strategies have a different way to play. Dark World, my boy. Dark World is the ultimate Yu-Gi-Oh deck.
Welcome to the Dark World. We have cookies.
Unfortunately for Yu-Gi-Oh players, we are in what we like to call a combo heavy format. That means cards like Droll and Logbird are everywhere, and Bystials are in just about everyone's side deck. I've come to the realization that I may have been a little bit delusional about this deck. After months of not doing anything, I finally have to put my foot in the mouth and admit that Dark World will take a really good pilot to be able to play. It's a deck that can be incredibly good, And then you can also have experiences like what TJ had in our last Rogue Vlog video and go X4. To be fair though, that's top deck TJ being top deck TJ. The biggest problem with Dark World will be deck building, but the biggest problem with DDD is gameplay. DDD can be such a satisfactory and rewarding deck to play, but it has two really big compounding issues. The first is that it's a pendulum deck, and it requires a brain to play. As you already know, Yu-Gi-Oh players don't read, and every single DDD card is almost like reading a newspaper. It creates ultra complicated play lines for a little bit weaker boards than some of the other combo decks. I'm gonna put it in takes a really good pilot. It's gonna take a dedicated pilot that's gonna bring the D's out for DDD and be able to accomplish what you're trying to do in any type of tournament. When I said DDD, I did not mean it like that. A lot of players have been saying in quite a few of my tier lists that I've been sleeping on Dinomorphia. I think that it's a fairly good deck. I'm gonna say borderline. This deck actually did top a high level event just recently. By no means is it a terrible Yu-Gi-Oh deck, but its flaws are still very evident. If your opponent can play around Dinomorphia Rexstorm, it becomes a really big problem. And if you ever hear Yu-Gi-Oh players you're in time, you with 69 life points, you're not gonna get very far. Earth Machine is actually one of my sleeper picks here. A lot of people can deal with Dinomorphia Rexstorm, but what they can't deal with is being FTK'd or being skill drained. Earth Machine actually has a weird combo where if it goes uninterrupted, it can actually FTK you with 2 cards. If you decide to interrupt it, well, it can just do normal Earth Machine things. It's also more than just an FTK type Yu-Gi-Oh deck. It's a grinding type floodgate like Yu-Gi-Oh deck that can almost make infinite resources. The only problem with this deck is that once you put the money into it, there's really not much you can do to make it better. Earth Machine is also a very xenophobic archetype, so you're gonna find a hard time trying to fit in some really powerful cards inside of this deck. Eldlich is almost like broke people Earth Machine. It can almost do the things of Earth Machine, except it's more floodgates. Eldlich isn't necessarily a bad Yu-Gi-Oh deck if you don't want to have friends. This deck is built on being able to use all of the floodgates to stop your opponent and then turn them off when it's most convenient for you. The problem with this particular deck would be going against some of the more powerful decks that can play through the floodgates or stop you from setting up. The Exo stepsisters, my boy. They say all my exes live in Texas, while my sister live in Alabama. I'm gonna say this is a top budget Yu-Gi-Oh deck. Exosisters are actually another strategy that has been doing well over the course of this format. It is a deck that is reliant on graveyard reliant strategies, but most combo decks are graveyard reliant strategies. It also benefits greatly from the reprints that just happened. It's a really decent Yu-Gi-Oh deck. I would also say the same thing about Floowandereeze. It did benefit greatly too. It was already cheap, kind of like Exosister, and it is one of the best budget decks in the game. Though there is one caveat between playing Floowandereeze. It's almost like Eldlich. Do you want to have friends? We have this one Floowandereeze player in my locals. He's been playing it pretty much since the deck comes out. He's an amazing guy, but he plays Floowandereeze. I've never seen him around a friend group. And the crazy thing is, I want to invite him to my friend group, but he plays Floowandereeze. I can't have that in my friend group. For Hire is still pretty for real when it comes to one of the better budget decks in the game. You might unearth some runic strategies when you play this deck, as it can draw into Oblivion and just out advantage your opponent. Fortunately enough for us TCG goers, Runic Fountain is not limited to one just yet, and that means that this deck is really good at being able to draw hand interruptions to stop your opponent and just combo off. It's solid. Or top budget, actually. Now, ironically, I could fit Spright in here. If you look at the most expensive cards for Spright, it is Spright Blue. Everything else is very manageable, and that makes it a budget deck, which kind of blew my mind. There's a couple of caveats about Spright. Right now, it has a definite ceiling, but since the Spright strategy is based off of level 2 monsters, and assuming that Konami will print more level 2 monsters, they normally do mess up and make some really busted card in the future. I would say that Spright is one of the better investments that you can make in this entire tier list because it isn't just tied to its strategy. And if you think about it, there's already a couple of great Spright decks. There's Spright Live Twin, Spright Runic, Spright are played in Furhire, Spright is played in Melfi. This deck is actually very versatile. If you pick up this deck right now, it is a little bit on the more expensive side of budget, but it's pretty much worth it. I would say that Gold Pride is on the borderline right now. One thing that I do like about this deck is that it can draw a ton of resources, meaning you can get a ton of hand traps, but the bad thing about it is that its inboards don't do enough. Overall, it is a solid budget Yu-Gi-Oh deck that does have its unfair moments, like summoning Psychic in Punisher and attacking for game. I will refrain from saying mommy milkers. God damn it, I already said it. But Labrynth is a top budget Yu-Gi-Oh deck easily. This is another strategy that's a little bit on the expensive side when it comes to budget, but once you get all of the cards that you need, oh my god, it is so worth it. And as long as normal trap cards continue to come out, this deck ceiling will only get higher. Just recently, we got Arius the Labrynth Butler, a card that wasn't thought of to be very good, but some of the best Labrynth decks have actually topped premier events using the card. So there's a lot of potential for this deck. Magical Musketeers was a strategy that you guys requested. If you guys remember a couple of years back, I actually won a locals with a $50 Magical Musketeer deck. Those were the good times. Where would I put one of my most prized budget decks right now? Yeah, we're paying the bills. In my head, probably the best way to play Magical Musketeer would possibly be Magical Musketeer Runic. There are better Runic decks, unfortunately. In order for Magical Musketeer to be competitive, there probably would need to be a drastic overhaul that would have to happen. Maybe even another monster or a couple of other monsters, spells, and trap cards to make the deck good again. I would easily put Marincess in solid choice. This is one of the better Cyberse Yu-Gi-Oh decks, and it's incredibly cheap. This is a strategy I said that you can build for $50, but the best thing about it is upgradability. Being able to implement even more powerful extra deck monsters like SP Little Knight and Triple Tactics Thrust makes this deck one of the most fearsome decks in the game. It does struggle just a little bit going second, but I think for the budget that you invested in, it's pretty much worth it. And Mathmech, I would put it in solid choice, actually over Ignister. Now you could play a Mathmech Ignister strategy that could work, but then you lose out on your room utility you can use for those board breaking or hand stopping cards. I like Mathmech over Ignister is because right now the Ignister cards don't do enough, but the Mathmech cards do enough for you to be able to win games. The only problem here is that Mathmech Circular is at 1, which I think is terrible, but if you make do with what you have, it can still be a fairly powerful good Yu-Gi-Oh deck. Magnaite is actually one of my favorite budget Yu-Gi-Oh decks and a deck that I really want to work. Unfortunately, I'm going to put it in Takes a Good Pilot. It's going to need some of those expensive going second board breaking Yu-Gi-Oh cards to be able to really compete. But one thing I will say, Kin and Jin is actually a blessing for this deck because it does help with a little bit of the consistency issues, but also puts a monster on your opponent's side of the field. Part of me actually wants to try out this Yu-Gi-Oh deck, but I don't think it has anything unfair about it to put it in borderline, so Takes a really good pilot to go. Nimlaria Grin Maju is a heavily requested strategy. You guys really want to know about this, what, maybe $10 budget deck? And in terms of being a $10 budget deck, it's probably hands down the best budget deck in existence. Inside of the budget tier list, when you have a bigger budget, I'd probably pay the bills instead. Unfortunately, this deck is just not powerful enough to keep up, though mad points to the people that are winning with their $5 to $10 budget Yu-Gi-Oh deck. Same thing with Ninjas. This deck is also incredibly cheap, ridiculously cheap, paying the bills instead cheap. Look, I don't know what bill you have for $10. Netflix subscriptions aren't even that cheap anymore, but I'd probably rather pay the bills instead than picking up these two decks right now. And you know, I love my Ninjas. The problem with these Yu-Gi-Oh strategies is that we have fair Yu-Gi-Oh strategies that are still good. These are way too forgiving in that regard when it comes to fairness and just don't allow you to be able to gain enough advantage against a lot of the other decks in the game. Somebody told me to mention Pendulum here, even though technically we've already mentioned Pendulum and DDD, right? I mean, to be honest with you, it's going to fit the exact same thing. I would say Takes a really good pilot. This is going to be representative of the Pendulum Magician, the Zark Pendulum, any Pendulum deck you can pretty much put in this category. And the reason why is because Pendulum still has the same problems. It requires a lot of your hand pieces to be able to make that particular board, and the payoff isn't as well as some of the other one-card combo decks. Pendulum needs a revamp at this point in time. Overall though, I think a correct Pendulum player can make this work. I've seen some ridiculous Pendulum boards, but every single time I see those boards, I'm like, they could have done something similar with less cards in a different deck. Now I'm going to go ahead and put Plunder Patrol in that borderline range. It's a very powerful Yu-Gi-Oh deck that can do some crazy miraculous things. The problem with Plunder Patrol going second, consistency sometimes, and other times just figuring out what you want to do with the deck. Plunder Patrol players are waiting for that win ship though. That's going to take over the game and let Plunder Patrol be top tier. But right now, borderline. really good things about it, some things that I don't like. What's really funny about Rikka is that Americans treat the deck like it's right here and pay the bills instead, but Europeans treat it as above top budget. They'd probably be disgraced that it's even in a budget tier list. I would say though that Rikka is one of the best budget decks in the entire game. It also doesn't necessarily have a cap because of the extra cards you can put to make it stronger, but also because anytime there's new plant support, it's Rikka support, to be honest. Scareclaw is crazy good, but has some secretly expensive cards to go into it. I'm gonna put it in solid choice. This is a deck that can control the tempo of the game as long as your opponent isn't playing Lynx. Fortunately enough though, Scareclaw Tryhard isn't the only way for this deck to be able to play. The Adventure Engine, the Scareclaw cards, and even Synchro Summon options to monsters like Bird on the Floor are very doable for this deck, and thanks to Rarity Collection, it's cheap. Red Dragon Archfiend will for always be in my heart. I think this is one of the better decks. I'm gonna put it in solid choice. Ironically enough, I've seen Red Dragon Archfiend do some crazy things at tournaments, which I think is almost past it. This deck should not be in solid choice. It should be in borderline because it doesn't have anything unfair going until it summons Red Supernova Dragon or OTKs your opponent. And you're like, huh, you did that? Also, we do have some confirmed support for Red Dragon Archfiend, so this deck does get a little bit stronger. Who am I kidding? The new support actually makes the deck a lot stronger and very much more competitive. Shark's Xyzs are down bad right now. Until we get that other Xyz armor card, I'm gonna put it in takes a really good pilot. This deck has some locked potential when it comes to 1 and 2 card combos, but unfortunately, we need that other Xyz armor card. Sky Strikers was heavily requested. I think one of the best ways to play Sky Striker is going second. Unfortunately, it's incredibly hard to go second in a combo format. I think against a lot of mid-range and control decks, Sky Striker does do really well, so I'm gonna put it in borderline. It's a deck that can actually be very strong in the right player's hands, but still does have some of those unfair cards that you can play, like Widow Anchor, and Engage, and basically all of the Sky Striker spell cards. Bro, they're searchable and reusable. Come on now, it's a decent deck. Springans was a deck that you guys requested. This is a combo deck that kind of lost its way ever since Cyberstein got revamped. For good reason. I think Springans does have a couple of great combos going for it, but I think it's really going to take a really good pilot to fine tune out those combos. Cards like Springans Talio are actually incredibly good. We're just waiting for the right monsters to be able to pair with it to use it. You'd be surprised that I say Superheavy Samurai is probably one of the best budget decks in Yu-Gi-Oh! My guy, this deck is actually really disgustingly good still. Ever since the Link 1 Superheavy Samurai card fell off a cliff, players have completely ditched this card, except for the Superheavy Samurai lovers. They have figured out how to make this deck a very decent, solid choice Yu-Gi-Oh! Deck. Granted, it isn't as strong as some of the other combo decks in the game, but a deck full of monsters with a ton of hand traps in a hand trap format? Kind of good. I made a $50 budget Sword Soul Yu-Gi-Oh! Deck, and I still think it is a solid choice for Yu-Gi-Oh! Players in the TCG. It's actually an excellent way to teach a player how to synchro summon, one of the best decks to integrate a new player in. Traptrix are an incredible Yu-Gi-Oh! Deck anytime you go first. Going second, you're almost like a duck in the water. If you guys have seen my staple tier list, you know exactly where I put evenly matched, and if evenly matched is your way to go second, you're in danger. I will also put Virtual World into the... You know what? I'm actually gonna put it in borderline. It's because I think Virtual World QB Shinshin is an unfair Yu-Gi-Oh! Card in today's game. Anytime you have a monster that can banish universal cards, think of cards like Catch Tier or Rise Heart, you're pretty incredible. This deck is actually immune to a ton of hand interruptions that players are using right now and can summon that monster pretty easy. And lastly, my boys, Volcanics. There have been some players playing with Volcanics, and I think it's going to be in Pay the Bills instead. Where I think this changes is when the new Bonfire card comes out in January. But currently we're in December, and this is a December budget tier list. And that's all that I have for the budget tier list, big dogs. Again, I know you guys have some strategies that you think I may have missed. Let me know down below in that comment section under the pinned comment. Of course, big dog, as per usual, I hope that your day is going phenomenal. And if it isn't, don't let what happened at the beginning of your day ruin the rest of your day. All I need from you is your undying loyalty. And if you're buying on TCG Player, use the link. If you're going to Dueling Guard, use the code CALI5. I'll catch you on the next video.